Sing back the cymbals. Sing back the cymbals.
You must sing back the symbols. The first one being your path. You are going to need protection on your journey, but your 4 angels will guard you and protect you. And I also will help you.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Jung To Live By. Today we're going to be finishing up our 3-part series on the red shoes, or in other words, on addiction, and how we can overcome addiction, and what addiction means on the psychodynamic and mythological levels. And if you've seen our first 2 videos, then you know that we've been describing addiction through the myth primarily of the red shoes. And of course, the most popular version of that has been Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Red Shoes. And we've covered a more recent version of it depicted in Kate Bush's music video called The Red Shoes, once again. And at the beginning of the first lecture, I remember saying, within these videos, within the myths, within the stories, there is not only the understanding of addiction, but also a promise potentially of how we can get out of it. Because it's not just a case of, well, I understand that in an addicted state I have red shoes on my feet and that they are out of control, they're controlling themselves and you're not aware of it and you're taken in by the enrapturing bliss of what you think is a euphoric, this is it experience. Really, there has to be something else to help you to take them off. And that's exactly what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to be using another one of Kate Bush's videos called Lily this time, which is a song that comes after The Red Shoes on her album, The Red Shoes. And it covers that exactly. It leads immediately on from the previous video, as you saw in that little cut at the beginning. And it explains how you can use the Jungian self, and indeed the positive side of the animus, or indeed the anima if you are a man, in order to overcome addiction. So hopefully this video and this series of videos itself will help you understand not just how addiction works and the psychodynamics of it, but maybe how we can get rid of it and how we can be happier, healthier, more balanced individuals.
The scene is set for the next stage of the journey, essentially. And it's probably useful, I think, to obviously focus on the white chair because of the character who's about to sit in the white chair. And there are 4 points of light on the floor surrounding the chair. The chair is central to them. And I think at this point, maybe we should introduce the next character.
Can I ask a super quick question on the number 4?
Yes.
And you can debunk this myth immediately. But
Yes.
4 I associate with quaternity, which is the self.
Yes.
Is that an incredibly crude, short of hand thing to do?
No, I don't think it is, because it's that suggestion, isn't it, of wholeness, and the chair is at the centre of the quaternity in this particular image, the way that the scene has been set. So I don't think that's by accident. I think that's significant, and as the video plays, it'll probably become more obvious too that that's the case. And then we have this lady appearing, this old lady appearing in the white dress, sitting on the white chair in a centre stage, literally the centre of the shot. And she's the character, Lily, in the video, but she's also someone that Kate Bush knew in real life and had a close connection with in the sort of mid-90s. And she was a spiritual healer and believed in something called mental colour healing as well. And so she's obviously someone who was very significant to Kate Bush in her own life, and she's probably been selected by her for those reasons. I mean, she describes her as being someone who was a kind of a strange mix of intelligence, intuition and kindness, to quote Kate Bush herself. And they're all qualities that I think you could say are associated with the wise old woman, if you like, who in this situation is appearing as in Jungian terms, as a symbol of the self. So she's obviously been picked for those reasons.
Come here, child.
So we could just stop for a moment, because it might be important to simply say here that because we discussed the Hans Christian Andersen version of the red shoes last time. And we had an old lady in that too. We had a child and an old lady, as it happens.
Oh yeah, I was asking you about that, wasn't I? I said there's no old lady in the video, and you were like, wait a minute, in the next video there is.
Yes, that's right. And in that story, we're looking at negative aspects of the self, both for the child and for the old lady. So you see a child that, and the other thing to say is that they're both instinct injured, which is why they're negative aspects of the self as opposed to positive ones, because the child is enamored with the shoes. She doesn't see the danger. She has a romantic relationship almost with the shoes. And the old lady doesn't see the enchantment take place between the child and the old soldier and the crippled shoemaker, who essentially are one of the same thing anyway. So you kind of move from a situation where you've got negative aspects of the self exemplified, and then the difference here in the Kate Bush video is that you've got a very positive image of the self appearing. So just an important difference, I think, between the two things, the two stories, shall we say. You see Kate Bush entering and immediately assuming a kind of childlike relationship to the older woman, the fact that she's sat on the floor at her feet, looking up to her presumably for her counsel, for her advice, for her wisdom. And you can see the left hand of the negative animus figure on the back of the chair. So at this point, he's still got some kind of a grip, some kind of a role to play in what's happening here.
You are under the spell of the red shoes, but you are not helpless. I'm scared, Lily.
So this idea that you're under the spell of the red shoes, like I say, the trickster figure still got his hand on the back of the chair. So at this point, you know, you're in a kind of psychologically speaking, a kind of a crossover phase where she's still under the spell of the animus, but she's invoking the help of the self, if you like, as exemplified by this Lily character. And the instruction here is that you're not helpless. It's I guess for anyone, particularly a woman who feels that she's under the spell of the negative animus, for example, that she's got nowhere to go, that she's helpless, that she can't do anything to loosen the grip of that. So if we just let it play a little bit more, and we can see what unfolds.
There is no need for you to be scared.
Can the spell be broken?
Of course it can. You must sing back the symbols. The first one being your path. You are going to need protection on your journey, but your 4 angels will guard you and protect you.
Your 4 angels will guard you and protect you.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a kind of invocation, if you like, of the positive animus and the connection with the positive animus, and probably in very simple psychological terms, the creation of a counter complex. I mean, we were talking about the idea of counter complexes yesterday, James, weren't we, after we did the podcast. And again, in a woman's life, this is incredibly important in loosening the grip of the negative animus when it takes hold.
And I also will help you. O thou who givest sustenance to the universe, from whom all things proceed, to whom all things return, unveil to us the face of the true spiritual sun, hidden by a disk of golden light, that we may know the truth and do our whole duty as we journey to thy sacred feet.
If we stop there, and you could see already the grip is loosened by this negative animus figure, and he starts to be pulled back into the unconscious, and then the Kate Bush character and the Lily character are off. There's that movement forward, that conveyance, the chair moves, suddenly it becomes a carriage, a form of transport. Sorry, Steve.
There was a circumambulation
There was as
shot
well.
as well, which
Yes.
technically is a dolly shot, which would have been a dolly shot in those days, but she's talking about things proceeding from and returning to everything, and then you have the circle then, which is placed within the 4 dots, and the chair makes the quintessential or 5th position as well, which will be significant. So there's an awful lot going on in there, and the negative animus is in a negative role at times, and sometimes he's in a positive role, and throughout the full video he flips, doesn't he? And
Yes,
and
he
this
does.
is part of the problem with the relationship to it.
Yeah.
You never know what mode it's in, which is what makes it dangerous, but at the same time you have to rely on it.
Yes.
Sorry.
No. I think that's very important. I think because too, again, in psychological terms, you often get something which is positive dressed up in something that's negative. And when he says about singing back the symbols, which is obviously as in all good fairy tales, part of the solution to this situation, nonetheless, because of the way that it's said, you know, it like Steve says, there's that ambivalence about it. But also, I think it's important, even with something that appears negative, to take notice of it, because there may be something positive in there dressed up in some other way. So for example, when he says she tricked you, you know, referring to the Miranda Richardson character, the alter ego character that you can see in the previous video, running off back into the unconscious and waving the symbols, that is something to heed, that is something to take notice of, rather than to just be, well, that's negative animus, I need to push it away. I must reject it. I must reject everything about it because it's so unpleasant and so disturbing. I think you have to see if there's a more positive message concealed in something which has been dressed up in a very unpleasant way, and that can be that can be anything. That can be any kind of negative self-talk, or if you catch yourself doing that kind of thing in everyday life, that's the kind of mindset you need to have in dealing with it, and literally of taking it apart, of deconstructing it, and freeing the energy that's tied up in that back into everyday life.
Just offer something at this point? Sorry, I think it's a really good point, because the negative self-talk is something that a CBT therapist would think that they were doing, but this is a transcendent rationality. It's not a reductive, one-sided, if you like, overamp thinking rationality. This is something which is transcendent in the sense that it's in connection with instinct, and so it gets beyond the polarity that you might get between, is this a good way of thinking, a bad way of thinking, and that sort of oscillation you get with CBT. CBT could not penetrate this deeply, and could not resonate with a woman internally at the level of her instincts, and therefore what she should do properly, because that's what an instinct does, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It tells you how to behave correctly.
Yes, I mean, we talked about Women Who Run with the Wolves yesterday, and Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who wrote the book. And one of the comments she makes in it is that the most important thing, for example, that a mother can do for her daughter is to give her the ability to believe in the veracity of her own intuition. And by that, it's a semantic problem in part, I guess. It doesn't just mean intuition as in typological terms. It means intuition as in your instinct in a given situation. So if something doesn't instinctively feel right, you should have a reaction to that if your instincts are intact.
Yeah, that's a really good point, I think, to get away from typology and the semantics that it can induce in people. Yeah. Because it's intuition in a sense, you could also interpret as being perception broadly.
Yes.
But it's an apperception. It's an internal perception of a connection that you should have had with your instincts
Yes.
and can return to.
Yes.
That's completely different from typological reductionism.
It is.
In the same way that this is completely different from a CBT kind of reductionism as well. This is why these myths are so powerful and so healing.
I mean, that comment, I feel as if life has blown a great big hole in me. I mean, I guess a lot of people could identify with that, you know, just in simple terms. But the point is, I guess, here is that despite the fear, she's on the journey. She's made that connection. She's opened up that channel to the self. And it's a healing connection. So no matter, you know, how big the hole is that's been blown in you, no matter how bad the addiction has been that's got a grip of you, there is a way forward. And I think, as Steve mentioned earlier, that idea of the chair becoming a carriage, a vehicle moving forward is in and of itself important, because it suggests progress beyond a particular situation that would otherwise have been destructive.
It's at the centre of the four. So it's quintessential and transcendence and a vehicle.
Yes.
So there's lots of layers there.
There is.
And there's lots of cultures you could look at to see how that is utilised.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of a yana, a vehicle, is central to Hinduism, for example.
Yeah, it makes sense as well if the self is the genomic self. Because it's, as you were saying, Pauline, it doesn't matter how big the hole that's blown in you, metaphorically speaking. It's like, yeah, because at the genetic level, you will always remain intact, even down at the stem cells. You can destroy as many as you want, but you're still there.
Yes,
makes a lot of sense.
Yes, it does. It does indeed. And I think it gives it gives a lot of hope too, that people can rebuild themselves, they can reform. It doesn't matter how bad the injury. I mean, it may take a little bit longer. But nonetheless, the capacity for healing is there, and I think that's a really important takeaway.
And she said, child, you must protect yourself. You can protect yourself. I'll show you how with fire. Gabriel before me.
Maybe just stop around.
I was
there,
enjoying that as well. Yeah.
I'm sorry, James. Do you want to let it run?
No. Carry on. I was enjoying it.
Yeah. I mean, we've got this sort of appeal again to the self for reassurance and comments such as, you know, I feel like I'm walking the veil of darkness, which I suspect is probably a Christian metaphor. But again, it's something that probably we can all resonate with. And I guess any psychological journey is like that. You do feel as if you know, it's unfamiliar territory, isn't it? Moving through the unconscious. And so there has to be some kind of guide, some kind of reference, some kind of inner authority to appeal to. And again, we've got the Lily character here who's performing that function.
Well, there's an embrace here as well, isn't there? Where in the last one there was the alter ego and the ego embraced each other, but it's like the facial expression on both of them is completely different to last time. This, like, beforehand it was like, I'll help you from Kate Bush. Now it's like, I need your help. It's kind of a bit of an opposite shift there.
There is indeed, and I think the fact that we've got this sort of older lady, you know, with the white hair and the white suit, and you know, she's got, you could see in the earlier shots, like a walking stick on the back of the chair, and so it suggests age, but not frailty. There's something still. There's a lot of strength, a lot of knowing, a lot of experience summed up in that character, and so the appeal from the Kate Bush character is to those qualities.
Yeah, is it the accumulation of experience
Yes.
that the elderly should have? They don't always,
No.
because sometimes a young fool becomes an old fool.
Yeah.
But ideally, older people have experience to pass on. And here you can see that with the embrace, as you rightly point out, James, it is a different kind of embrace.
Yes.
Before she moves on.
Yeah.
And she said, child, take what I say with a pinch of salt and protect yourself with fire.
And here you start to see, well, obviously you see the angels coming into play, but also you'll see that the Lily character circumscribes a ring of fire on the floor, which with a walking stick, and creates a kind of a safe place, a safe area. And here we have the fire of transformation rather than the fire of cremation and annihilation that we saw in the previous video.
Yeah, the walking stick is a wand.
Yes, it is.
Effect.
It has almost a magical.
Yeah, so it's a way of delivering the energy from the self.
Yes.
So it's not just supporting a frail old woman, it's actually the way she supports herself on the ground. It's the earthing quality of the self and the capacity to transmute energy from within the self to the environment, symbolically.
This reminded me of the stance of like pulling the sword from the stone, something like that.
Yes. Well, with respect to the animus, and a woman's unconscious, as we've said before, is characterized by logos. So the upheld sword, I would imagine, is connected to the idea of intellect and the ability to be able to think well and to discriminate and so on. So, and this is just one of the four elements of the animus as portrayed here. L'Oreal, it is on my left side with this kind of, well, a sphere is basically a three-dimensional circle. So we've probably got connections there to the idea of the self, and the totality, the wholeness of the self, but also silver as well, because that's silver is, in alchemical terms, one of the base metals, part of the transformative process. So, and also it's connected in philosophical terms with the moon, and with femininity and female intuition and all of those kinds of things. So you've probably got a lot of things summed up there in that particular image.
In the circle of fire.
Like a deep grr there as well, a kind of, it's almost like an earthy sound, isn't it? Instinctive sound. Yeah.
That's like a little demon face, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's like burning off the dross, burning off the demons, those things that would steal your energy. And we've discussed that before in previous podcasts about the animus appearing as some kind of a demon.
It's also the actual appearance of it is very close to the one from the 1957 film Night of the Demons.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
She uses something from, doesn't she, in the Hounds of Love video, which we've looked at before.
Yes.
So this is obviously an exposition of her personal myth as well.
Gabriel
And we've got this kind of water effect again, haven't we, that we had in the previous video, which is obviously just the use of cloth, but the suggestion is of moving through water. So again, probably a link with the unconscious there, and moving through the unconscious with these, 4 pillars of the animus almost surrounding her and protecting her.
The spell is being broken.
I can't go on. I am torn.
The spell has been broken, and the idea of going back to the idea of singing back the symbols for a woman essentially is singing back your joy. It's the idea of getting back to those things that give your life meaning, and holding out for those things that really give your life meaning, as opposed to any kind of substitution for that.
And it's saying, obviously singing back the symbols, you were saying earlier that it comes from the negative animus, but in that particular case, the negative animus wouldn't be acting negatively. So it's kind of becomes a point where you can't reduce it down to one thing. It becomes its own system after a while. It's like he's playing his role. We call it negative, he's just playing his particular biological role.
Yes, absolutely. And like I said before, depends what you mean by negative, doesn't it? Because something appears unpalatable and you feel you want to push it away doesn't necessarily mean you should. You should at least try and extract from it something of value, something of meaning before you decide to bin it all together. So, I mean, it might be useful at this point to come on to the idea a little bit of complexes. And how they operate, you think, Steve? Or
if you wish, I think we should do a full
separate podcast.
No, but you could discuss them, love. Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, because we've gone over them a little bit over the shadow video. So if people have seen the video on integrating the shadow, which I'll link in the description down below, then there should be enough of a primer, I guess, to get us going.
Yeah, well, like I say, if a complex really is just a group of ideas that's held together by an emotional tone, then it's worth looking at those ideas. It's worth looking at it. I'm obviously speaking now as a woman, and the relationship of her woman to her animus, which is the bridge to her ideas. And it's looking at the kind of fictions, if you like, that we construct for ourselves as women, and how we might deconstruct them. And like I say, release that energy back, release that libido back into our lives and turn it into something meaningful and something productive. But if we just see the face of the demon, or we just see the tricksterish animus and we want to push it away, we don't want to listen to it, we don't think it's got anything of value, then that's going to be very difficult to do. So there has to be, I guess, because it is a journey, there has to be some, and it is a heroic thing to do, to examine yourself in that way. I think you have to have some courage and not be afraid to do it. In the same way that Kate Bush expresses her fear and her uncertainty and so on. I think you have to assume that there will be elements of that in you as you go along and you uncover things, but you have to have the courage to do it. Just as if we were to go back to the idea of Bluebeard, he doesn't want you to become conscious. He doesn't want you to, put the key in the door and open it and look at what's really there, look at the problems, for example, that you might have in your life. That people do put things away and close the door on them. So it's having the courage to not be put off by that, and to say I'm going to look anyway, and to not give in to the threat that, well, if you look, you'll die. That's what will naturally ensue. If you choose to look, it's not going to be very pleasant, and you're going to be threatened with death anyway. So you best not need to start in the first place.
Yeah, it's a common fear, isn't it? Really,
it's a very common fear.
Anyone gets when they access the dark side, really.
Yes,
and not just the shadow, but any kind of really strong complex which is creating inertia around the ego will have that fear. Primary ones, I'll call them primary complexes, which include obviously the parents. If there's been a wound on a parental complex, that will have the same characteristics as the negative animus, or the negative anima would, without the parental complexes being constellated. So sometimes you get a conflation where there will be, say, the animus and the father complex working together, which kind of squares the effect rather than merely doubles it. It really does amplify it. And it'll be the same for a man too, if it's the anima that's involved as well as the mother complex, because it is a soul image and it is a relating factor. So if the wound is there, it will affect everything. And that will leach out, and it will affect every social relationship that person has, not just on the inside. So yeah, it's an important point, Paul.
Yeah. I think also too, though, in any good story or fairy tale, the solution is always embedded in it if you look for it. And I think this is why a lot of modern myths fail, because you might, as Steve was saying yesterday on the podcast about creativity, you have a cast of thousands, you have all these so-called archetypal figures, but you have no real through line, you have no real story, and therefore you don't have any real solutions to things either. They're kind of incomplete. And you see that a lot, don't you, in modern myths?
They are. It's one of the problems with dreams. The dreams can be like that, and one of the paradoxes is that they're both important and unimportant. Important in the sense that if you catch the moment with a dream, you can get a lot from it. But if you miss it, there will be more. This is the journey work of dreams which we can come to. But there's another correlation, and that's soap operas, which very rarely solve anything. They're just a waveform that go on in the background. Like the kind of dream that doesn't resolve a damn thing, as Pauline was saying. Well, soap operas are like that, and if you want to really move on, you have to get to grips in a dialectical sense with the psyche and what it wants from you. And if you do that, it will interact back. Then you'll start to see change, and that, of course, means that you're going to feel a little bit of pain.
Yes.
Because the old way of remaining in balance will be displaced. And whilst you're seeking a new homeostasis, you have to come to terms with an unfamiliarity with yourself, because the future you is different to the you that is today and the you that you've been in the past. And then guiding your way through all of that is the role for a woman of the animus, and for a man for the anima. Yeah.
You have to expect some fight back from these things.
Yeah. Not off.
That's not uncommon.
No.
And I don't think you should be put off by that. I think a lot of people are. They think, well, I believe that they put everything in place to make a change, and that therefore it should be a straightforward transition. But often it isn't. There's often a lot of pulling and tugging that goes on the inside before you find that new homeostasis.
So in something like this, just quickly on how the self might come into this, just as an example, it's quite a hopeful thing. So you've got that negative self-talk you were talking about earlier. There's this voice in your head, and it's saying like, you are nothing. You deserve you deserve X, Y, Z. Things aren't going very well. At the bottom of it, at least for me and the people who I've spoken to, there is an underlying sense of, and not typological, you're right, just intuition, that's not right. It's not you. Just that little glimmering light, which most of the time you don't see, but it comes up when you most sort of need it, or when someone else comes along. Is that the self? Essentially going like, this is your true self. This is the real voice that's calling you back, not the nonsense negative self-talk that's coming through.
Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's semantics again, I think, getting away with it.
It's nuanced as well.
Yes, it is.
It's deeply nuanced. a lot of the perceptions that the ego has when it's going through this process are mythic, in the sense that it creates a fantasy about what it's experiencing. The fantasy can be a negative one, and say, for example, that the inner voice, I'll say of the anima, the inner negative voice of the anima is an actual inner woman, you know, and there's plenty of people who will tell you that that's the case. And then, as you rightly say, there's this other voice in the background, or other feeling, other vague quality, which suggests that it's not the case, that you're not identifiable with that negative, destructive voice. But for some people, this negative voice will kill them. It will lead them to suicide. It will lead them into a long-term slow death through substance abuse, or being in a continuous state of stress. So your physiology goes into a catabolic decline, and eventually into the entropy of death. So yes, it can be a death demon. But remember, and this is so important, and it's difficult to get to, much of this is an internal projection from the genome towards the ego, and that internal projection then appears in the form of a symbol or of a character which articulates. Now, if we then receive that symbol and we reify it and turn it into an autonomous identity, so we believe there is a real inner witch, if you like, who is trying to destroy us, we are then confirming and creating that internal suggestion. And that is extremely dangerous, because we can suddenly then live in an inner world which is populated by demons that are partly our own creation. And some of this is ingested. I'll use the expression ingested because I think it's more definite than introjection. Ingested from the environment, ingestion as in going into your metabolism, into your physiology. And so the darker or more destructive side of the potential within the genome appears then as the negative side of the self. So projections don't just go out from the psyche into the environment, they operate internally, and they come from the background of the mind. And another nuanced thing which I would offer for people to reflect upon here is that the boundary between what we call the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious is not that certain. It's something that we can infer and also suggest to ourselves in terms of how we interpret what comes up from it. So we can say, oh, that's a complex, therefore it's in the personal unconscious. And that's an archetype, therefore it's in the collective unconscious. All that you can know for sure is that you're experiencing something that comes from outside of ego consciousness. Yeah. Its exact psychographical, in other words, like the geographical, its exact psychographical location will be uncertain. And you can't really be sure what it is that you're experiencing. But what you can be fairly sure of is that you are receiving a projection of something from outside of the ego towards the ego that appears in a symbolic form, because symbols carry a very broad bandwidth of information, massive. The pre-linguistic, obviously, and they relate back to a very early period in evolutionary history when impressions based on instinct, on survival, would have appeared in consciousness as the image of a whole situation, which then over time, over repeated generations, as the human species evolved and were able to develop language and therefore culture, then these impressions become externalized, but then feed back. So we have to remember, as Jung pointed out, that there is an evolutionary psyche, and the older forms of communication are still real. But where is the boundary between the personal and the collective unconscious? And are we really seeing an archetype, or is it a complex? Is it an ego fiction? And this is why, one of the reasons anyway, I prefer to focus on instincts, because they're very, very clear, very, very clear, easy to understand, easy to observe in people, easy to observe in animals. And also why what Jung called, following Durkheim and Claude Lévi-Breuil, representation collective, collective representations. These things are out there in the environment, and they will be internalized, and then they will meet what is already in the unconscious, and they will then produce an autonomous element. But is that in the collective psyche, or is it really in the basement of your personal unconscious, where there will be an overlap of things that are perhaps so deep that they're very, very close to instinct and very, very close to the genome? So we can't be too trite about this, about what you're actually experiencing, because all you do then is create another box. which you can contain yourself in. By yourself, I mean your own reflexive understanding. But myths, yeah, definitely are very, very powerful, because there is this tendency for the unconscious broadly to create narratives and to create images. And sometimes the only useful way that we can communicate with these is to project them into culture and then resonate with them internally and externally and come to some kind of understanding of what they are. But they appear to have autonomy because they're outside of the ego's control. And I think that's why we then, to go back to what you say, have this apperception of more than one apparent voice or symbol at work, one perhaps destructive and one deeper. And if you make the wrong choice, and now we're in the territory of fairy tales and myths here, if you make the wrong choice, you will pay for that wrong choice. So the culture can guide us on this. The culture has what Richard Dawkins called memes, which are basically ideas that replicate, not the meme as it's understood currently with respect to the internet, but it's a kind of informational carrying system which is stored culturally and is inherited, if you like, culturally, and can evolve culturally. And when you think about it, because we are biopsychosocial entities and we exist simultaneously at all these different levels, there's a constant exchange of energy and information. So cultural storage of information symbolically as a collective representation, yes, is an archetype expressed as a cultural complex, if you like, that we can resonate with. So be very, very careful about how you define things, because you can box yourself in literally and then miss the empiricism of what you're actually experiencing.
Well, you can, to come back to instincts for a moment, because as you say, it's a very simple way of understanding things, is to think about what happens either to people or to animals when instincts aren't able to be expressed in a healthy way. And if you cage a wild animal, for example, it doesn't take long for it to emit distressing behaviors that suggest that animal should not be living in those conditions. So I think wherever you see instincts frustrated, it's probably the best place to go, actually.
Absolutely.
To understand them.
Maternal deprivation. And so many people that, James, you and I know through various sources have suffered from a wound with respect to early bonding with the mother, for whatever reason. And, that is an instinctive issue. It's on an instinctive template. It's not like the child just popped into existence out of nowhere in a literal sense and is an empty vessel. They're born with instincts, with expectations and with patterns of behavior that are supposed to be in sync with impressions and patterns of behavior that they receive in order to survive. The archetype then becomes a kind of collective fantasy, if you like, a myth about the way that instinctive process should unfold. And this is why the archetype in itself, according to Jung, you can only experience the image, but the image in and of itself reflects an expectation. So there's a biological expectation, and then there's a cultural expectation, and then there's the instinct. Throw all of them together, and then you get your typical myth or your typical higher order fantasy film, which is trying to show the hero's journey and so on. All of these things are based on instincts, all of them. And if there's an injury to instinct, there's an injury to everything. And it's at that level, really, ultimately, the cure needs to be made. But you can use narratives, as we were discussing yesterday in the creativity. You can use narratives, you can use myths, you can use imagery, you can use all of these techniques to access the genome. And yes, you really can do that, because you can affect gene expression by using imagery, by using creative products, by using trance states in various forms. It's entirely possible to do this.
Yes. Well, I asked the initial question about the little voice of the self, because it's the hopeful aspect of it. Because, as you're saying, if you take the myth, in the way it's described in those two videos, she's obviously not in a good place, or she thinks she's in a good place. She has her red shoes on. Then she's not in a very good place. And then the negative anima says, sing back the symbols. The fact that she asks for help, and then we move into the Lily video, and she gets the help that she needs. It's at that level which I want to move from myth into reality just for a second and be like, and I don't like to use the word hopeless, but you know what I mean? It's not as if the self itself is naturally going to swoop in and save you. It's something else that's going to come in, which is why you can't necessarily live within the myth. Because otherwise someone might be like, oh, okay, I'll get myself to a point with an addiction, and then naturally something will swoop in and save me, right? because as you were saying, Steve, it's like depending on which voice you listen to, etc., you're dealing with actual biological reality here, where we have, you know, people they don't, sometimes things don't end in the nicest way, you know. So how would one go about using, say, that particular myth to transition from the first video to the second video, if you get what I mean, from the state of euphoria and then not very happy at all, into a state of actually those four angels can help me, some of which is, you know, the logos and the intelligence and whatever the equivalent is for the more masculinized psyche. How would one make that shift using those particular myths?
Well, I guess there's a sweet spot for everyone, isn't there, with regards to their own health and their own homeostasis. As I think we've said before, anything which is to an extreme is not good. Even too much creation is not good. So it's finding that balance point for yourself, both in an inner and an outer sense. It has to be both. I mean, just to come back to instincts for a moment, if you're using the caged animal analogy, a lot of people who are instinct injured behave as if they're a caged animal themselves. So you open the cage for them to let them out, and they just sit there. Yeah. Because they're so conditioned to being in that particular situation that they don't know what freedom means for them anymore. And then there's the fear, obviously, about leaving the cage.
It's got a lot of relevance at the moment, because this global lockdown is going to have a hell of an effect on some people. They're going to feel like caged animals, and you can only suppress the cork for so long before those stresses emerge. But just reflect on this. All of those stresses are instinctive. All of them. You'll all have everyone's going to have access to fantasy to relieve the stress through the media. They can put on YouTube, they can put on Netflix or whatever, but that will work. That will break down after a while, and it will hit the extroverts hardest first. It will. And it'll hit extroverted intuitive types hardest first. Yes. And I don't mean this any kind of typological reductionism or the passing on of a hex or anything like that, but the type that I would predict the most likely to suffer first will be the ENFP. The extroverted intuition dominant with the introverted feeling mix are the people who are going to suffer the most from the idea of being trapped and incarcerated. And when they can't satisfy themselves through fantasy, through a media, then that's going to be really, really explosive for them. Obviously, people who are extremely introverted with sensing dominant are probably going to be able to cope with it better than anyone, because they're already on the interior. But even they will get affected eventually, because at an instinctive level, we're not meant to remain in the cave. Even cave men and women didn't want to stay in the cave. The cave was a refuge, but all their resources were outside of the cave. They had to be hunters and gatherers. The cave was a place of retreat and of security, but it wasn't where they wanted or needed to be for health. And this is going to have a serious effect. It'll be interesting, I guess, to see what happens to the creative industries through this. What happens to Netflix? What happens to Hollywood? What happens to the collective psyche? We shall see.
Yeah. So to bring instinct into that typology just for a second, because that might be interesting. The different drives in typology, they're not necessarily instincts in and of themselves, are they, or are they?
They're propelled by instinct. If you think that your personality type is just basically the manifestation of consciousness, it's your conscious attitude. Yes, of course, the mirror of that to some extent reflects the unconscious, but it doesn't reflect the deep unconscious. It's rather like the immediate shadow of your ego. So it's the delivery system for instinct. It's the delivery system for archetypes. It's the delivery system that you meet with people. So it's relatively superficial, but the deeper you get into the psyche, the less differentiated type is. And then there comes a point when it's just irrelevant, completely irrelevant, because you're dealing with things which are so fundamental. If people, such as resources. I mean, if you get people fighting in a mall or a supermarket over food, it's got nothing to do if you're an intuitive or a sensing type. It's far too fundamental for that. It's only when things are settled that these things will then differentiate out and have any kind of meaning. Obviously, therefore, in an everyday sense, type is important because you will see drives come through. But with extroverted intuition, to go back to the ENFP example, yeah, of course, their instincts are for gratification, frankly, very often with some ENFPs, are delivered through extroverted intuition. But again, it's only the delivery system, and it's not the instinct of itself. You could look at that in the same way as you could say an archetypal image is not the archetype in itself. Yeah. Well, extroverted intuition is not the instinct that it delivers in and of itself. It is merely the delivery system.
Yeah, well, I bring up type because you were saying about going outside. And maybe this is me being a caged animal, and it might be. But I have no desire normally to go outside.
There is one behind you.
There is actually a brand new little hamster. In fact, that's a good question. So I would have an instinct instead to, rather than go outside, to go outside of my mind. Not in kind of like, you know, getting high type of way, but it would be more of an inner exploration type thing. If you take Jane, for example, and you said you can no longer care for something, you can no longer use your extroverted feeling. Is that coming in at kind of like an instinctual level? So the instinct, if your positive life force, if your positive creativity is the libido that needs to come out of you, then it's like, does the individual type manifest in terms of how that should come out, right? So if you say like, put me in a job, which was say, for example, and I've done this before, put me in a retail job. I'm like a caged animal, and I can't, and I won't do it, and my psyche will like shut down. And I mean that colloquially. It's like I will not do it.
Health for you. That doesn't have health for you, does it? It doesn't have meaning for you personally.
Yes.
And so if you're in an environment like that, you become instinct injured very quickly.
Yes. So this goes back to the whole handmade life type of idea, where it's like you can't just cookie cutter everyone down to the same level, because we will have individual differences. And it's like if I was to say, Jane, you can't bring the hamster home.
Yes.
Because even though it's going to be stuck in the shop and he's going to be lonely and he's going to perish by himself, you can't. Her caring instincts will be like, you know, not particularly very happy. Although maybe I should put my foot down every so often. I don't mind the hamster. He's all right.
If I can ask, because I don't know the answer to the question, what would the natural habitat of a hamster be?
Well, this was born and bred in captivity. I don't know where hamsters come in the wild, but he'd be living in a big cage and he'd be doing his snuffles and his running around and playing with hay and all other kinds of things. Yeah,
well, we assume that that's what's good for the hamster, don't we?
Yeah, I would have absolutely no idea, to be honest with you. Yeah. I don't, wild hamsters. If anyone knows in the comment section, that'd be interesting to sort of let us know, I guess.
The ones that we had that fought to the death, and one was virtually decapitated, were Siberian ones, which I believe are notorious for being aggressive, and that you can't put two males in the same cage. Well, our kids decided
that's this one. Yeah, we can only have one, and it's only a man, in which they fight to the death.
Yes.
So those instincts are still there.
They are.
And to destroy, to fight between rival males. Well, why would they do that? Why? There's no females to compete for, but in the cage where there's only two males, but there's all the other instincts that all summate up to the same thing. And when you think about it, mythic narratives, which are archetypes, they're there to teach us how to handle instincts properly. That's it. That's all they're for. If you boil it down, anything else is an ego fiction which distracts it.
Well, it's window dressing, really.
It's window dressing, yeah. So it kind of distracts you from your instincts, and it distracts you from the fulfillment of health by a displacement into a myth, an artifactual myth.
That's not to say that that's not helpful, but I think you just have to be able to make that discrimination, don't you?
Yes, you do. Yeah, I am being a bit hardcore on this deliberately, because the tendency to displace into fantasy, not just now, but anyway, has been ramped up massively during the information age, and we've lived long enough to know what it was like without that.
Before,
whereas a lot of people now have grown up with it and don't know any difference, so they're living in that sort of cross-modal zone between the realities of biological instinct and fantasy.
Yes.
but they're edging more
both
towards...
Both need to be met.
Both, yeah, but it's healthy.
But you're forced to emphasise this because otherwise it would go unnoticed. It would just be overlooked.
It would go unnoticed.
Yeah.
And the thing is that when you meet people who are suffering, that they are suffering fundamentally from damage to instinct,
yes,
and adaptation to that and to lifespan development and individuation in that genomic sense. They're not suffering from a lack of having availability for fantasy and displacements. There's too much of it.
Yeah, I was thinking of the early Greek myths, the Homeric greats, when you were saying about instinct, because there is a lot of archetypal reductionism, and it comes to be like, well, Odysseus is just after unification with his inner anima, and there's all this blah 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 blah. If you look at the story of the Odyssey, it's like it is pure instinct. Really thinking about it, it's like it's her name's Penelope, isn't it? She's doing her stuff, and then all the men are basically being like, "I want to breed with you now," and then it takes Odysseus to come along and be like, "No, you're not," and then they kill a whole bunch of them as well, and be like, "My woman."
Yeah.
It's like,
well, if I can just add to that, forgive me for sort of being so blunt about it, but having pets for women usually is a preparation for having children.
Definitely, 100%.
You just see it over and over, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that because I've done it myself, but that is what it is. Yes. That's where it all starts, James. I warn you now.
Well, no, I definitely know. It's when Jane comes home with like clothes for Flynn. So I got him a new coat today, and I'm like, why? He's a dog. Why does he need? Like, for God's sake.
Because he does, James.
That's exactly the answer I get. Because well, he has to. Then he has to. Can you please transfer me X amount of money because Flynn needs this nice hat? And it's like, he bloody doesn't need the nice hat. Yes.
But it is all preparation, isn't it? It is all preparation for that ultimately. Yeah.
So to make a meaningful life, you do have to satisfy instincts, but get beyond them.
Yes.
If you try to get beyond them without satisfying them, there's a major neurosis immediately, and it's what I would call an individuation neurosis, and I think is the general class of neuroses from which all of us emerge, is the individuation neurosis, the separation of instincts from the higher order aspects of personal development. And
this goes back to, presumably, right the way back to Freud. I don't know if he was originally the one who said it, but like, neurosis is the price you pay for civilization, basically. And so you're basically just put it in more Jungian nomenclature, essentially, to be like, this is why it's so important, because of the lifespan release, essentially.
Yes.
I would think with Freud, he's much misunderstood and much maligned. I really admire his courage starting out with Joseph Breuer. They did incredible work against incredible inertia within the culture within which they flourished, and they had immense courage to go places that no one had gone before in that way. There were precursors to them. The early hypnotists and even the mesmerists were exploring uncharted territory in a completely new way. And yes, Carl Jung goes on about Carl Gustav Karus and Edward von Hartmann and others who were pioneers of the notion philosophically of the unconscious. But those guys really went after it. They went after it in themselves and in others, and they did it with a view to healing people who were suffering. And in so doing, they opened themselves up to everything that was so a massive admiration for the early pioneers. They are real heroes, more so than a lot of contemporary would-be heroes of the psyche. Those guys, they ploughed the furrow within which we can seed our own development, and we would do well to remember that.
Definitely.
Yes, we would. We need to be careful too of people in the culture who are instinct injured themselves, who haven't healed themselves, for want of a better expression, but nonetheless are, out there trying to heal other people. It's something to be careful of, isn't it?
Yeah, like Jung said, open wounds cross-infect, and if somebody has a wound to an instinct, and then, it could be that they have, for example, I'll use the example of Maternal because we were illustrating that before. A therapist of whatever theoretical orientation has a wound with respect to that, then meets women who have issues over becoming a mother, and it's not been properly dealt with, then there's 2 wounds,
me,
and they're likely to likely to cross-infect. And Paul and I have both met fairly recently. I won't identify it as a woman who was a therapist and who had a very peculiar attitude towards children.
Mm.
And on the sexualizing of children. And this woman had no children of her own, but she had a mission to go out and encourage children to be prematurely sexualized, and she was using her therapeutic approach as a vehicle for that. And she was looking for validation from other therapists from different schools. I honestly believe so she could conceal that within the camouflage of respectability from other people. So in effect, she was going to deliver a perversion, and this had to do with issues of her own instincts that had been damaged or were being expressed in a malignant way, and then she wanted to occupy a cultural system, the psychotherapy profession, at least a portion of it, in the same manner that a virus would occupy a cell, and then the immune system wouldn't realize that this was malignant and it would get away with it.
Yes.
So that kind of thing does go on, and we do have to be really, really careful. And when you're training therapists as well, you'll see that the fundamental issues have to do with the individuation neurosis, as they do for us all. You know, have we come to terms with instinct, and are we individuating to our potential, which has to sit on an instinctive base? If it doesn't, there are going to be problems. And one of those problems is the projection of fantasy into the grand excuse that it's an archetype. You know, be careful.
I don't want to get anybody into trouble, but in terms of stuff like that, it's something I've noticed at universities, and universities don't like me very much because I actually speak what my mind tells me to speak. But there is this sort of overlap between sort of philosophy and the more psychology-based stuff. I've chatted to loads and loads and loads of people. It was usually in the pub because I was at university, and it was like women, for example, most of them at that point would be like, I never want children. And that never struck me as something right. Maybe because I've always been grounded in biology, and it's like, so if a female wolf or something comes up to me and goes, you know, in wolf language, I don't want to have children, it's like, something's wrong with you. And I'm not saying something's wrong with the women. That is something I have to stress. It is not a value judgment, but it is a misdirected instinct for whatever reason. And it can happen, I would guess, on an individual level, and that's okay. But when you get groupthink essentially coming in, and it's justified under philosophy, and it's justified under philosophy under an admin banner, then you enter something incredibly dangerous. Because when I've tried, for example, to be like, this is the way you go towards health, for whatever reason, it's like, health doesn't matter. Health is a culturally defined construct. And it's like, there's a frustration there, but at the bottom of it, it's not the philosophical layer. It's like people speaking an autobiography about their own frustrated instincts. Would that be sort of a correct way to summarize it?
Well, I agree with you, and I think it's very important to say that in individual cases, the general does not apply. It doesn't.
It just can't, can it?
It just can't. I mean, some people don't want children, and that's their business. End of. And there's no point, applying any kind of collective value to that, whether it's biological or socioculturally based, and certainly not personally or psychologically based. But going back to the general. And there is a biological imperative to reproduce, and that we're all under that instinctive pressure. It's how we come to terms with that. So for an individuation neurosis, for example, I would regard it as perfectly reasonable for somebody to say, I am making a conscious, rational decision that I do not want children. And that's absolutely fine.
But it has to be that,
but it's got to be that. If they're just in a state of neurosis because they are completely and utterly split and are suffering, and they don't want to suffer anymore, then they have to come to some kind of conclusion. And that conclusion might be that they don't want children. And that's absolutely fine. But to go back to my earlier example, if you have somebody who has a warped sexual drive in the direction of children, and is then trying to construct a means of delivering that through a camouflaged sociocultural system, then that is pure evil, I'm afraid, because the children themselves will be the victims of a predator, and the predatory instincts will be there too. As I'd said earlier about an earlier podcast about, if you know where somebody's libido is broadly,
Yes.
you will know everything about them.
Yeah.
Now, you take a paedophile, for example. Paedophiles, I'll use an analogy. If you want to catch a lion, go and stand with a zebra. They'll soon turn up, plenty of them.
Yeah.
If you want to catch a paedophile, they will be wherever children are.
Yeah.
Wherever they are.
Yeah.
Access to children is everything to them.
Yeah.
Their libido is invested in them, not just sexually, but in terms of interest, motivation. They're interested in children's games, in children's minds, in children's television programs, all of that. And in a Pied Piper way, whatever children can be used to pull them away from any kind of protective situation, whether it's parental or whatever. So that is definitely a perversion. In my book. I'm afraid that's something that I'm absolutely immutable on, and I can't change that. And that's probably for instinctive reasons, because children biologically are the future of the species, and they are so vulnerable. So my own instincts are mobilized and protectively towards them. So I find it very, very difficult to have any kind of humanistic concern for predators, child predators.
Yeah.
So,
and they can be men and women.
And they can be men and women. And
which is important.
And they often are women, and they get away with it a lot more.
They do.
Because
it's less obvious
and they can slip in under the radar, which is why I mentioned that one earlier. A woman who had no children, but wanted access to them in order to sexualize them, which is a form of, if you like, long-term grooming, because as those children get older, they will replicate that influence, and that makes children as a sort of broad category available for predation in the future. It's rather like a squirrel storing nuts. Horrible, isn't it?
But again, to come back to the idea, I'm thinking mothers and daughters rather than any other relationship. If like I say, if mothers don't, for example, teach their daughters and their sons, I guess, to be aware that these things are out there in the environment and to trust their own instinct on things, then you're creating a whole new generation of people who are instinct injured.
Yeah.
And on it just gets replicated, on it goes.
Yeah. I mean, breastfeeding, right? I'm not going to pick on women over this, but I'm going to highlight some issues that can arise over that. Failure to wean a child from the mother is a problem. Failure for a mother to wean herself from the child is also a problem.
Yeah.
And both of those things can exist simultaneously and can cause terrific damage. And this has been known for at least 130, 140 years. It's been recognised within depth psychology. And there are whole schools of depth psychology that are based on it. So that's just an example of something which can appear to be right, can appear to be instinctive, and can appear to be natural, and is, but can nevertheless be diverted for other purposes and can have a negative outcome. So this is why nuance is very, very important, and why the context for a specific case is always important. Obviously, most mothers that breastfeed do so effectively and efficiently, and there's no problem. But there are instances where that is not the case, and there are other things going on. And if you work with people who suffer, you see this psychopathology and this psychosocial pathology and instinctive pathology at work. And it's distressing. And sorry, go on.
Sorry, Steve. No, I'm just. It's not breastfeeding per se, but I'm thinking about the guy that you worked with many years ago, whose mother forced him to sleep with her.
Yeah.
I mean, that was absolutely. Even now, it's distressing.
It is
to think and talk about, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's not. I don't want to trivialise the poor guy's experience.
No, of course not.
But oddly enough, since then we've met a few a few young men. Who are still in that situation, and the whole, I'll say, psychosexual development.
Yes.
It's more than that, because it has to do with the development of someone's identity in such a fundamental sense, that to not be separated from the mother and then to be forced to have sex with the mother and to interact sexually with the mother as an extension of, in this case, of breastfeeding, and then it went all the way up to adult penetrative sex. and maintaining and controlling that man in that state, that is a form of evil. And you can see where the idea of the so-called archetype of the devouring mother comes from. That's not all mothers, but it does happen. It does happen. And if you work as a therapist, you have to
you'll meet it,
and you have to come to some kind of understanding about this if you're going to help people. And of course, the reverse is true. You get the other side of the incest, where it's father to daughter, and then you get same-sex incest. You get all sorts. You really do. And at bottom, this is a disturbance of instinct.
Yes. So that is flat out line in the sand. That is a disturbance of instinct.
Yeah.
Oh, without a doubt.
It must be. What else could it be? Because Freud was right. There is an incest taboo, and that's instinctive. Although some cultures will modify and ameliorate that to some extent and allow it to some extent, it is very, very rare. Most cultures and most people have a natural revulsion, and that natural revulsion is based on the genome and it's based on instinct. And then you get the Oedipus complex, which is a myth, if you like, reflected back. So you have this existing at the level of the genome, you have it at the level of instinct, you have it at the level of the complex, the Oedipus complex, then you have its correlation culturally. So the same thing exists at all these levels simultaneously. Everything does, by the way, because none of these levels functions on its own. And that's why it's very, very important to understand when we talk about archetypes, for example, they're not just biology, they're not just psychology, they're also sociocultural, and they're all three simultaneously. And it's how they interact. And that's where people will learn things, when they understand the nuance of the interaction.
Yeah, very, very important. And this is why I tried to stress it earlier about biology versus philosophy, and use philosophy incredibly loosely, because you have to go back to biology, because if you don't, you can make a rational case for anything you want, and the danger with that, of course, is if somebody is convinced of it themselves because of their own misaligned instincts. That'd be the thing. And it's like, you can't argue, say for example that woman who you knew who wanted to essentially sexualize young children, they could probably make a good rational argument for that, which is a terrifying thing, because people do it all the time.
She tried it on, and as soon as we realised that that's why she wanted to associate not just with us, but with a group of other therapists, she was trying to form this sort of, she was going to be verified by us collectively. Well, that was the end of it. It had to be.
Good. Yeah, and that would be your instincts coming out to
Oh,
stop
definitely.
that.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And if you ignore instincts completely, at your peril, you can philosophize all you like. They will destroy you.
Yes, I like that. And that's probably a good place to leave off, unless there was anything else in particular you'd like to say on this subject, because I want to bounce in about 20 minutes' time.
No, I think that pretty much says it all, doesn't it?
Sweet.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Jim.
Wonderful. In which case, thank you,
Jane.
both of you.
Yeah.
And thank you, of course, to everybody watching this. Of course, as always, if you'd like a free copy of the Shadow Integration Manual, link in the description down below. And if you'd like to support us on Patreon to gain access to a whole suite of different benefits, then we'd really appreciate it if you go check that out too. But until next time, everybody, thank you. See you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Blessings.